Melanoma Matters is an educational resource, and the opinions we express are our own and do not reflect medical advice. If you have questions specific to your own situation, please contact your own clinician. This podcast may be available in both audio and visual, so please check your platform.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Melanoma Matters. I'm Sapna Patel.
And I'm James Larkin. Hi.
Today we have a special guest with us, Megan Othus, who is Professor of Biostatistics at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center and also our statistician at SWOG. And it's timely because we've had a lot of discussion about time of day infusions, and there's a lot of people that have started to look at their own data sets to say, oh, it's there. The problem is people are looking at their data sets and wanting to see the pattern. And so they gravitate towards that and they're missing like all the confounding things. So meanwhile, Megan will take us through what are the things we're supposed to think about when we think of time of day and how we can't just look at that in isolation and find the signal that we want to see. So that's a long way around about why we have a guest on our episode today. Megan, we often like to start with just a little bit of background for our listeners or viewers. Maybe you can tell us where you grew up, where you did your training, where you studied, and this kind of like double Reed connection you have. You went to Reed College and then you married a Reed, which I think is cute.
Well, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so in Portland, Oregon, and I'm in Seattle now, so I was able to kind of return home, or as close to home as I can kind of have my job. And I went to Reed College, which is also in Portland, and majored in math. It's a small college, so it didn't even have a statistics department or a major. There was one professor of math who taught statistics, and I worked at the reactor on the campus because I had a undergraduate run reactor, and I got interested in cancer through kind of that exposure, like learning about radiation exposure and radiation as a risk for cancer anyway, and then ended up wanting to do math that meant something. And so that felt like maybe statistics was a way. And I went to that statistics professor and asked him, I said, I want to go get a PhD, probably in statistics, but maybe like statistics for cancer. And he said, there's a whole bunch of programs for it called Biostatistics. You should do that. And so I printed out all the schools that had those degrees and brought them to him and just said, like, where should I apply and where should I go? And where can I get into? I don't know any of this. So anyway, I ended up at Harvard on the East Coast, and I was told if you want to end up on the West Coast of the U.S., it's good to get your PhD on the opposite coast. So where do you want to end up? So I did it. I went and visited and decided to go there, and then came back 5 years later and kind of jumped straight in from my PhD into an assistant professor position at the Fred Hutch, spending a lot of time with SWOG. And that is where I have been now for 17 years about. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how to design convincing trials for rare patient populations. And I really enjoy thinking about data in general. And I'm married. My husband his name is also Reed. It's spelled differently. The college is 2 E's and his name is EI. And we met in college, and he is a public defender in the U.S., and our work days look very, very different from each other. But we ended up here.
I love it. Well, you are in Seattle now. Oh. So any chance you are going to go see a World Cup game?
We're not going to, but we are hosting friends who got, are hosting a series of friends who got tickets to a World Cup game, and my husband and my son are off. We're taking the bus to go watch a movie, and said, I think the U.S.-Australia game is, and there were people already in jerseys, like all over public transit, like 6 hours before the game.
Amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing. So, okay, James, over to you. Questions about time of day. Specifically, maybe, do you have our set paper citation to reference, et cetera, et cetera?
No, I don't. But have you got it there? Well, you've said which journal it's in already, and then Megan, you're the lead author, so congratulations on that. I won't read out that whole title unless you want me to. And Sapna, you're the senior author, I think, right? Is that enough information?
You always read out the title, though.
Okay, I'll do it.
Oh my goodness.
Here we go. Pull back a bit. Addressing biases in analysis of time of infusion, NCI/SWOG trial S1404, among participants with high-risk resected melanoma who received adjuvant anti-PD-1 therapy. How about that?
Excellent.
Yeah. Anyway, congratulations. I think it's great. So that's the first thing to say. Can I quickly ask you, Megan, what your PhD was about? Because I don't think you said. I'm curious.
Oh, my PhD was about complicated censoring mechanisms. So statistical methods in settings where there are complicated censoring mechanisms. So if you're looking at, say, well, there were a bunch of different, I had a trial with kind of correlated, trying to account for different censoring mechanisms based on the institution in a multi-institution trial, if there's some sort of different differential follow-up and accounting for that clustering in the data. I had some work on like change point problems where kind of your effect kind of takes like a big step jump. A lot of statistics depends on, this might be going back to like, pre-med school for you all, but like taking a derivative, and you have to have in general a smooth function to take a derivative. What about when you don't actually have a smooth function? What can you do? When in reality, it just isn't. You can't take a derivative of it. Just the real world, that doesn't always happen. And then also thinking about the sorts of settings when you're looking at, which is becoming more relevant now for melanoma, rather than overall survival, but death from melanoma specific survival, and you have that competing event. You have other other events that can come along, kind of accounting different ways for that. So like math and like kind of how should we do that?
The other thing that comes up in melanoma-specific survival is when people are then lost to follow-up and you then get a death report, but you don't know what they've died from. How do you handle that? Are they censored? Are they not,
Yes, that happens all the time in SWOG.
Yeah.
Which reminds me, that's on my list of things to do, actually. Exactly that. For our sort of long-term experience of ipi-nivo and melanoma, I'm not sure I've ever quite got around to doing that, because it might be that we can get some traction on that. Anyway, that's a slightly separate issue. We've talked about that before. Yeah, just our institutional experience.
Yeah.
Anyway, wow, that's great. So, I mean, I suppose the first question would be, why might this matter in the first place? I think because that's the whole point of this, isn't it? This whole idea that the time of checkpoint inhibitor infusion, and I guess it is specific to checkpoint inhibitors rather than other types of immunotherapy, which is a question as well, I guess.
Well, actually, this summer I'm going to be looking at allogeneic transplant and CAR T, because there's a cancer cell paper and another paper that more recently, since the melanoma, since the PD-1 that came out. So,
man.
Yeah. So I thought I had seen something in another journal. But anyway, the Fred Hutch is a big place where there's lots of transplants, and we have a long database, and folks who didn't know that I did this paper, they just know that I work a lot in leukemia, asked if I wanted to help with that. And I said, oh my gosh, yes, this is perfect timing, because so not just this. Now people, I think any immunotherapy more broadly, at least in oncology, people are
kind of beginning to us.
Because of all the attention it's gotten for checkpoint.
Yeah. And then the next thing, I mean, when I first heard about this, whenever it was, probably a year or two ago now, I can't exactly remember how it originally came up, but the next thing I wondered, and I think a lot of people have said this as well, is, well, hang on, these drugs have got really, really long half-lives. So, surely it's only the time of the first infusion that might be relevant, because after that you're going to effectively have loads of drug on board for the next several months. Do you think that's fair? You're both nodding.
So I can say at least how I came at this was purely reading these papers as a statistician and not knowing the science, all the science behind the checkpoints. And so I read the papers and found a number of recurring statistical issues, which is why I wrote the paper. But then when I came back to my clinical colleagues with it, they provided all of this information that I didn't know about those receptors being saturated, and they're really, it's just not, several of the investigators said, like, it didn't make any sense, these results, but I couldn't explain why. The data were that they were being published. And so it felt to me like there's like this sense of relief when I could kind of break down some of the statistical reasons that you might end up with the answer they did, but still be consistent potentially with the intuition there is about how these agents work.
Yeah. So I guess the basic hypothesis would probably be something like, if you give the first, let's just say checkpoint inhibitor for the sake of this discussion now, and put to one side all the other different types of immunotherapy at a certain time of day versus another certain time of day, categorical, but there's probably loads of detail in there as well, that there may be more efficacy. And it seems like the story is about giving it earlier in the day, in the morning, is better than giving it later in the day. That's what I've taken away from it. But maybe it'd be good to hear from you some of the, let's say, pitfalls or catches, or what you've come across in the data, because obviously, you're an expert on this.
So I'm trying to figure out where to start. So thinking about that. So when you pick, even like as you were saying, kind of generally earlier versus later, but how do you draw that line of early versus late? The day is many hours, and in general, the analyses have kind of done this two group, like an early, late, and picked a time that they consider to kind of do that. So that's always problematic when you have something that could be, if you're thinking that this is somehow circadian rhythm mediated, you would think that somebody who had it 1 minute before that deadline versus 1 minute after, their outcomes probably wouldn't be that different. But by the nature of kind of slicing it at that time, you're going to put them in two different bins. So, but that said, what most papers have done when looking at this is they essentially look at all possible cut points that you could chop the day into for early versus late, and they did their statistical test, usually a log rank test, and then compared early versus late, and then picked the biggest one and said, that's how I'm going to analyze the data, and then went through their data showing that. And so there's a number of issues with that, but for people familiar a little bit with statistics, like the multiple comparisons issue is something that's pretty well understood. And so when you look at lots and lots of things, you have to adjust your p-value to account for that. And you know that you're also, when you look at lots of things in one data set, you may be picking a time that is very particular to that data set as an artifact of that data set, and may not actually be able to translate and be reproduced elsewhere. And so that was one of the very easy things to see. I said, well, why? And what struck me when I was reading the literature was how that time, that early versus late time, varied from publication to publication, because rather than take the previously found time, and I mean, what I would think as a statistician I would want to do is, if somebody already published, I'm going to take their time and see if I can validate it in my cohort and report that validation. And that isn't what was being done. I don't know if they checked it, but by doing that analysis and not finding the same number does mean that also there wasn't a lot of consistency. And those early versus late time points went from 11 in the morning to 4:30 in the afternoon. So it was a pretty big span of the day that was being chopped. And these algorithms are going to give you the time that gives you the biggest split, regardless of whether it makes sense. that make sense? Like it's just an algorithm. You put data in and it's going to give you a number out. Even if kind of the actual trend is not kind of this bifurcated outcomes. So that was one of the issues. And there are ways to get it. I mean, one, you can adjust your p-values for multiple comparisons, but also you can visualize how that trend, how that association changes over the day. And if you would expect there to be a circadian rhythm pattern, you would expect to see some sort of pattern, some sort of shape or bell or bowl or some sort of shape or kind of plateau that would be consistent with that. When we looked at our data, it looked what I called a sawtooth. It was just like up and down, up and down, up and down, not indicating any specific pattern for time of day. And then the algorithm picked the tallest sawtooth, but it wasn't that there was any sort of what meaningful pattern with it, other than that just happened to be the spot where there was the highest point.
And James, if I can add some historical context here, there was this paper out of Emory called the Memoir Study, where they looked at the checkpoint inhibitors retrospectively that they had given, and they wanted to see if there was this time of day association. And we can certainly put it in the fact check if we need, but they did pick their date based on, they looked at all their infusions and maybe they picked their median time. And so then it was before and after, or as Megan said, they put the data in and they just picked the one that has like the biggest difference, the time of day. So once we saw that paper, I said to Megan, well, we've now done this 1,300 patient study. Can you do it like that? So she did exactly what she said as a statistician would do. She replicated their cut point and said, okay, by using their cut point, do we see a difference before and after? And we didn't see a difference. So then I went back and asked her, okay, well, don't use their cut point, just any cut point. Is there any cut point? And Megan's like, of course I did do that. I mean, that's the next thing she was going to do is look for a different cut point, that doesn't match their data. But there just wasn't one, as she's saying. You can statistically ask the computer to tell you what's the time that has like the largest difference between the two groups. And then it didn't fit any sort of trend. So like an hour before, 15 minutes before, 15 minutes after, like the pattern of that graph goes in a different direction. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense that there's actually an actual cut point on the time of day. So anyway, and then there was this whole issue of, a lot of these papers were saying, I think you're an author on one of these papers that did it. I'm sorry to point that out. I think Checkmate 238 did it in that NEJM last kind of final publication on it. And it said, patients who got the majority of their first 6 months of infusions in the morning maybe were trending to a better survival than patients who got the majority of their 6 months of infusions in the afternoon. But then Megan will tell us there's an inherent bias in looking at data that way. Right?
In our paper, the hazard ratio goes almost to 1 15 minutes later, like Sapna was saying. So again, so these papers, on top of showing their one time, should also report a sensitivity analyses, at least a couple other, one, show all the data, but two, show that it's robust to a 15 or 30 or even 60 minute, because if it really is circadian rhythms, that should not be, that much time should not matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in my defense, I'll probably say that in that publication, I think it could have been analysed differently. Let's just say that, shall we? And so then the other question in my mind is going to be about confounding factors about why people have treatments at different times of day. And the obvious ones might be that, let's just say that people who are younger and fitter and, they don't rely on transport to get to the hospital, they can have their treatments earlier in the day. And then maybe the people are coming later, just for the sake of the argument, they might be more elderly, they're getting transport, they've got more medical conditions, maybe they've got more symptoms from their melanoma in this case, which we know is absolutely a prognostic factor. And in the analyses done so far, have there been any attempts to control that, or is it not even worthwhile trying to control that because we need to do a prospective randomized trial to really nail this question properly.
Well, I think it's important to at least try and control for it. You can't do it perfectly. I mean, retrospective will never be as convincing and definitive as a randomized trial, but you should at least look and report and see if that hazard ratio is attenuated when you take into account those patient factors, which hadn't been done. So that was one of the other things we did. And one of the big ones, so it's on my list of things to ask an intern to do, is I have this kind of free text on this trial. So I should also say most of my trials don't collect time of day. This is actually my one trial in 17 years that happened to, because it was an FDA registration trial. So in general, we don't collect that data. So it isn't easily available. But so we have this, we have a medical history that was right in text that was provided to us. I am hoping to maybe have a student, with the help of AI, give us like a more comprehensive description of kind of the health status of different patients and be able to control for that more explicitly. But I can control for performance status. And one of the big things we could control for was the distance it took, or the distance between where they lived and their infusion center. And that is also associated with, in the US at least, the further you live from where you're getting your cancer treatment, on average, the worse your outcomes are. And there's lots of reasons for that, kind of the sorts of jobs and education and the socioeconomic aspect of it, but also how close you are when you have a bad side effect, and how long it takes to get. And so for some of our patients, it just is not physically possible to have an early infusion without, say, coming the night before and spending the night, which was not the plan for this study. So in our data, we could show, or it was very clear in the data, the further you live from your infusion center, the later on average your infusion was, which I think everybody can kind of understand. Though getting even better data to get a better sense, we also did collect quality of life measures on patients. So that's another way, which we didn't in this analysis, but to think about how to incorporate that if kind of the patients, they're just feeling worse and it's just harder to do everything if they schedule their appointments later. Another feature with that kind of timing, since for checkpoint inhibitors, patients are getting them over time, bringing up that analysis Sapna mentioned, was that the time isn't static for most patients over the course of their therapy. It changes. And at least in our data set, the longer you were on therapy, the earlier your infusion was. And when I first saw, I wasn't expecting that when I went to go look for it. I just knew I needed to account for the fact it might change over time. But then when I saw this signal and I was thinking about it, I think it was a week that I was making appointments for my kids, and it was, they needed to see the orthodontist, and I was just going to take a bracket for orthodonture was off or something. And so it's like, I'm just going to take the first available appointment. I don't care what time it is. I'm just going to deal with it, versus when I schedule, there are appointments that I can schedule several months out. Then I'm going to pick one that's like easier for my life and my schedule. And so I don't know, but one of my hypotheses is for data, and you guys seeing patients and treating them, I understand how that could happen over the course of their therapy as patients have more and more control over being able to schedule their appointments. They're choosing, or maybe they're feeling better as the therapy is working. But the big thing is then when you so one, you need to account for it, but two, in that, at least in our data set, the longer you lived, the more likely you were to have more than half your infusions early. And so there was kind of this built-in bias there when you don't account for that change, just by the nature of the scheduling dynamics of a large cohort of patients.
In analyses where we say, the majority of your 6 months of infusions were in the morning or in the afternoon, what's the type of error we're making, or what's the type of bias we're incorporating? because we're dropping off patients who maybe took one infusion in the morning and died or recurred. And so they never are in the data set of took 6 months worth of infusions.
Well, okay, so there's two things. So the correct way to do it is do exactly that, to just start with your subset of patients who made it to 6 infusions. And then I wouldn't say it necessarily is biased in the sense of the outcome, but it now only applies to the subgroup of patients who make it to that point, which is not all patients. So it only applies to the patient who then is sitting in your office after 6 infusions. It's not the patient who, before they get their first infusion, you're advising them because you don't know if necessarily if they're going to be in that group or not.
Yeah.
So then there's a question of who does that apply to? But actually, a lot of the publications analyzed everyone that way, starting at the beginning. And so that is where the bias really came in, was leaving everyone in there. And that was why they did the majority. So then you also, if you only had 4, they could still calculate it and kind of put you in a bin regardless. And so they both of those. So the second analysis is just wrong, and it needs to account for the dynamic nature of like the time of infusion. And then the first analysis, you just have to be really careful in interpreting it because it doesn't apply to all patients. It applies to this subgroup that like lived long enough, doing well enough on the therapy to be sitting in your office talking about that.
James, a question for you. Because the half-life is generally 20 to 25 days for checkpoint inhibitors, and so if we think it takes 5 half-lives to clear a drug, so now we're talking 100, 120 days, so 3 to 4 months plus. Do you think there's any relevance about what happens with infusions number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 when they're being given every 3 to 4 to 6 weeks?
I don't see why it would, unless there's a sort of a subtle effect between, drug on board and then even more drug on board, as it were, which I think the difference is going to be small. And then, the other thing about immunotherapy in general, I think in checkpoint inhibitors, it's not necessarily just about the drug being on board, right? These drugs can have, as we know, permanent effects on the immune system. So maybe if you take the analogy of flipping a switch, once you flip that switch, it's flipped, right? There's all sorts of examples of that, I think. I was going to my next question would be to say, do you think there's anything more to learn from retrospective data sets at the moment that we don't understand? Or are we now ready to say, look, this is an interesting question. Actually, it's not clear that there's really an effect in there at the moment. So we need to just do prospective randomized studies.
So before the Nature Medicine paper of the randomized trial in China came out, I would have said, I think everybody should just reanalyze their retrospective data. We should adjust the p-values. We should think and have like a more accurate view of these retrospective analyses and put them in context. And say, after we presented ours, a number of people have contacted me to say, we looked at our data and we saw no signal, but then we just didn't publish it because it was negative. Yeah. So I think there's also just kind of that simple publication bias also. Yeah. So one, I wanted to write the paper to show how to do the right analyses. 2, then hopefully ask people, say, hey, can you redo it, kind of accounting for these nuances and adjusting for your p-values, and then hopefully also create a space where then there could be some more balanced publication to show this isn't the only trial that didn't see a signal. And since this was accepted a couple months ago, there've been a couple oral and like abstract presentations also not finding a signal. So I think there's some, but with randomized data, and I realized that the current, I haven't looked in the last couple of weeks, but a couple of weeks ago, it still kind of had the banner saying they were investigating that trial, but the effect in that trial is really big. And I realize it's lung cancer and I realize it's chemoimmunotherapy. But given the momentum of all these retrospective analyses that were wrong, plus that result, I'm not sure that I think a randomized trial will probably be needed to be convincing for some people. I think it's too bad because it shouldn't matter. From the data that I've looked at least, and maybe at an individual hospital, it does matter. But, I think one of the nice things about the trial we looked at is it was conducted at hundreds of hospitals across the US. And so we're incorporating that variation that actually exists in the real world of where patients are getting treated and showing up at kind of, for the most part, their local hospital and what that looks like. But I'm convinced, but rather kind of the general, what would be convincing more generally, randomized data, I think, is just more convincing. I think that there is equipoise for that randomized trial. I don't see any I don't really see any that we won't be harming patients. I think the biggest thing though is whether the patients already have cancer, and to have a burden of making them worried about the time that they're getting their therapy, and that if they have family or other responsibilities or just feel too terrible and can't get an appointment until and don't feel like they can make an appointment until later in the day, feeling like they might live it's not just like a subtle effect, right, that is being reported. It's a really meaningful difference in how long people live. And so a randomized trial kind of perpetuates that burden if we have to do it. But then that trial may not have a representative group of patients, because the patients who have to travel further, who just can't be there for a morning infusion, probably will just have to say no. So then, I don't know. And ideally, a randomized trial, maybe in a country that's smaller, and so where those travel times.
Yeah,
But I have heard from when I presented that even in smaller European countries, this kind of distance effect is observed there too, not just in the US. So
yeah, there were some excellent points there. I really agree. The point you just made about people kind of feeling bad if they can't get there. And just a couple of other points, which is that we've already, and I'm sure everybody has had lots of interest from patients, because this got a lot of airtime, this story, and actually even colleagues are saying, oh, should we change everything? And I just said, well, no, I don't think this is sufficiently compelling at the moment. I think, I don't know what you think, Sapna, but I think the other thing is that probably people will be interested to hear what you think about the Nature Medicine study, because it's a bit of an elephant in the room, really, isn't it, in terms of prospective data. And I don't know, I think it'd be wrong to finish without saying at least a bit about that, as much as is known, let's say, at the time of writing. Sapna, you want to say something, I think. Go on.
No, I think Megan tried. She did sort of say the difference they saw in that study was almost extreme, like kind of hard to believe. But it's chemoimmunotherapy. So then what's the effect of chemotherapy on time circadian rhythm? And there has been some stuff published on chemotherapy and time of day. But as far as I can tell, the reason it's also under review is that the protocol versions that they kind of listed on clinicaltrials.gov doesn't quite match. There's just like some inconsistencies between the protocol versions and then their record on clinicaltrials.gov, not the least of which, I think Megan said this, is what triggered that time of day now. What even triggered them to do this analysis? Because this wasn't the primary endpoint all along, right?
Yeah, their primary endpoint, they changed the time. And the final version of the protocol that was included with the paper doesn't have an event-driven analysis for progression-free survival. And so in general, when you analyze progression-free survival, we do it based on events that tells us how wide our confidence interval is. And so that's where our precision comes from. Or a fixed time point, say 3 years after the last patient was randomized. Those are essentially the only two. Maybe you could come up with like a combination of them, but you have to formalize exactly when you're going to do your analysis and pre-specify it and do the analysis. And for those of us in clinical trials, we've sat around waiting, right, to have that time happen. So we know that you don't just get to pick it, you have to sit and wait and follow the protocol. The protocol didn't have analysis point included, which might be related to the change in the design and the time. But those times changed over the early late changed, at least in the reporting of clinicaltrials.gov over time. But in the conduct of the trial, they perfectly met their assigned time of the published version. So just kind of understanding, I think there's questions about that versioning of the trial that at some points at least wasn't listed as a randomized trial, was listed as an observational cohort, understanding what kind of really happened and what reflected the reality. There are so I went exactly to the design, just like how did they pick this, all those things. Though that's what I went to, but other people have seen that some of the protocols, there's multiple versions of the protocol, but there's protocols from say 2022 that have papers from 2024 in the references. So there's also some versioning, like documentation that is unclear also. Yeah.
Maybe I'd like to conclude with 2 points, if that's okay, you guys. This S1404 paper it looks like we looked at a little over 600 patients here. Megan looked at it. Let me not act like I did anything here. So these 600 patients, it does seem to be one of the largest data sets on this time of day question. So that I would just like to make that point. And then secondly, I just want to read off the conclusion here that our co-authors, they did have input on how we were sort of putting this in context for a clinician. And ultimately, one of our co-authors, I should probably say the name, but really felt strongly we needed to put a real punctuation on this. What should people be doing with the time of day and organizing their infusion schedules? So here's the essentially last sentence of the paper. These findings do not support reorganizing infusion center schedules to prioritize morning administration of adjuvant anti-PD-1 therapy for patients with melanoma, which would have substantial operational implications. So I can't remember what it said in 238, and we can always fact check that because that was the other adjuvant anti-PD-1 story that looked at time of day. But it seems like right now, and recognizing that this is an adjuvant setting and metastatic setting, there could be other factors at play. Again, other confounding factors, other things that have to be accounted for. In the adjuvant setting, it may not be reasonable to start reorganizing. And then the other thing that's sort of top of mind, now that we've switched from infusions to subcutaneous injections in a lot of places, what does that mean? It takes about 4 days for that subcutaneous injection to get into the bloodstream. So now does it even matter what time of day that shot is? Because ultimately it's about it getting systemic. So anyway, that's probably a nice place to stop because there's future work to be done here, I think. Right?
Yeah. Well, no, that was great. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. And congratulations as well. Because honestly, I think, the field in many ways and the discussion, because there's been lots and lots of discussion about this, was sort of crying out actually for something like this. So fantastic. And I hope people read the paper and cite it a lot as well.
Or they just go back and reanalyze. The hard thing with that randomized trial, but I hope people go back and look at their data and it gives them, especially groups that looked at it internally or were part of that and then reorganized their system. Go back and look at, if the signal's still there, okay. But if you actually do the appropriate analysis and that signal isn't there and you're making patients and physicians' lives harder to kind of accommodate this,
why?
Yeah, why?
All right, great. Well, thanks, Megan. This was wonderful. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye.